The invitation landed on my desk like a taunt. James's wedding, another reminder of the role I was supposed to play, the overlooked daughter, the quiet failure. As I scanned the details, I remembered every snide remark, every dismissive glance my family had ever thrown my way. At the rehearsal, I watched them glide through the room, their pride and self-importance filling every corner. No one offered me a word of acknowledgement. Even my parents' eyes skimmed past me, like I was A. I felt that familiar sting of invisibility, the hum of being underestimated. Yet, beneath the surface of my quiet restraint, a thought began to take root. If they were this blind, perhaps I could move without them even realizing it. Observe, record, and wait. Something about this wedding felt like more than celebration. It felt like a stage, and I wondered who would stumble first. I reminded myself to stay measured. No outbursts, no explanations. They didn't deserve them. This was their narrative, and I would quietly rewrite mine. I sipped my drink, letting the chatter swirl around me, asking myself, how much longer could I watch them stumble in ignorance before I intervened? The question lingered like smoke, soft, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. They treated me like a ghost, a placeholder at the table rather than a person with achievements. Every compliment they lavished on James felt like a reminder of the role I was never allowed to occupy. They assumed I was still struggling, that my life was a series of small, quiet failures. In reality, I had built Atlas Industries from the ground up, turning it into a $2.4 billion empire while they bragged about their imagined successes. The irony tasted sharp as I watched James grin for the camera, oblivious that the deal he was about to rely on was one I controlled entirely. Even my parents moved through the room with the ease of entitlement, unaware that the daughter they disregarded was the very force that could collapse or elevate every plan they had. Each misjudgment, each casual dismissal, only sharpened my awareness. I gave more than they ever noticed: time, patience, guidance, yet received only empty gestures in return. The imbalance was palpable, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I catalogued it mentally, noting every slight, every laugh at my expense, every assumption of my weakness. By the time the first toast began, I understood something vital. The stage was set, and I was quietly the only one holding the strings. The question was no longer if I would act, it was when and how, without giving them even a hint of what they were about to lose. During the seating arrangement, the subtle snub landed like a deliberate nudge. My place at the head table was nowhere near James, and Victoria had taken it upon herself to sit directly across from me, a thin smile that barely concealed her amusement. A waiter placed my plate last, barely acknowledging my presence, and I caught James glancing over with a fleeting, uncomfortable smirk before returning to his guests. It was small, almost laughable, but that was the point. I felt the familiar flush of irritation, the reflex to react, to remind them I existed. But I didn't. Instead, I inhaled slowly, letting the moment settle like sediment. Every slight, every overlooked gesture was a piece of data, proof of the assumptions they live by. They had no idea who I had become, no inkling that the empire they assumed I would never achieve existed entirely outside their awareness. The tiny pattern of disrespect revealed something bigger: control. Their arrogance and ignorance created opportunities, and I had spent years learning how to exploit them with precision. I made a mental note of the subtle alliances forming, the whispers of old family tensions resurfacing, and the unspoken hierarchies that governed this room. As the music swelled and laughter echoed around me, I realized that this wedding wasn't just a celebration, it was the perfect vantage point. And from this quiet corner, I could see exactly where to place the first move. As the evening unfolded, their dismissals grew bolder. James toasted Victoria with a flourish, his words dripping with pride, while I remained on the periphery, a quiet shadow of success they refused to acknowledge. Every attempt I made to engage, offering a small comment, a congratulatory smile, was brushed aside, replaced with polite nods and the hollow courtesy of someone they barely tolerated. It stung more than I expected. The sting wasn't in being ignored, it was the clarity of it. They had no idea who I really was. No one paused to consider that the woman standing beside them, quiet, measured, and restrained, had quietly built a company worth billions while they flaunted their small victories. The realization sent a ripple through me. They weren't just ignoring me, They were underestimating me on a scale I could exploit. I observed their conversations like a strategist on a battlefield, noting the lapses in judgment, the small exaggerations, the casual overconfidence that seemed to permeate every interaction. Every brag, every misstep, every assumption of my weakness was a thread I could pull. They treated me as a prop, a familiar shadow in their perfect picture, but shadows could shift, and when they did, they changed the shape of everything around them. By the time the band struck up a familiar tune, laughter and chatter filling the hall, I felt the first stirrings of a plan forming. They had drawn their lines, revealed their patterns, and unknowingly handed me the blueprint for control. All that remained was to decide how and when to use it. Later, a conversation with my parents made the pattern unmistakable. "Are you sure you're ready to handle things on your own, Naomi?" my mother asked, her tone soft but laced with condescension. "We just worry you might be overextending yourself." James added, with that familiar half-smile, "You've always struggled to see the bigger picture, sis." The words were carefully measured, designed to make me doubt myself without overt attack, a classic dance of gaslighting. For a moment, I felt the echo of the old frustration, the quiet sting that had followed me through countless family gatherings. But this time, I didn't react. I didn't defend, apologize, or explain. I simply listened, cataloging each inflection, each subtle attempt to destabilize me, each assumption they made about my competence. Their ignorance was consistent, predictable. They were so convinced of my failure that even their concern was a weapon. But the more they tried to unsettle me, the more clarity I found. I realized that the doubt they sought to plant in me could just as easily be reflected back onto them, highlighting their own mismanagement, their reliance on assumptions instead of facts. I sipped my drink, letting the ballroom swirl around me, noticing every small look exchanged, every whispered aside. Their patterns were laid bare, pride, arrogance, and entitlement driving their narrative. And in that quiet observation, I found a strange sort of satisfaction, not because I was above them, but because I could see the pieces clearly, ready to move them when the moment came. By the time the speeches ended, I understood one undeniable truth: their confidence in my supposed weakness was the exact leverage I needed. The reception reached its peak, and so did their attentions. Or rather, the lack of it. James pulled Victoria into a circle of family and friends, laughing at some private joke I couldn't hear. My presence was acknowledged only in passing. A nod here, a polite smile there, as if I were a decorative piece rather than a person. Then came the unintended humiliation. A distant cousin, unaware of the tension, loudly recalled an old story of my supposed failures, projects that never took off, investments that fell apart, and the quiet chaos of my 20s. Laughter erupted around me, not malicious, but enough to sting. My parents didn't intervene. They smiled politely, pleased that the world reinforced the narrative they had built. Even James, caught up in his pride, seemed amused. I felt the familiar rush of heat, the instinct to defend, to explain, to remind them who I really was. But I stayed still, letting the story settle, letting the room swallow the illusion of my defeat. The humiliation was public, the imbalance visible, and the world could have believed I had truly lost. Yet, beneath that surface, a quiet clarity emerged. Every laugh, every misguided assumption, every glance they believed was dismissive, was recorded in my mind, catalogued, and filed. Their pride, their arrogance, their misjudgments, they were predictable, and that predictability was power. The audience of friends and family thought I was diminished, but in reality, I was watching the exact threads I would pull when the time came. By the end of the evening, while they basked in their imagined victory, I realized something profound. The public perception of defeat was temporary. The private truth, the truth they couldn't see, was where the leverage lay. And if I waited patiently, the shift would be complete, sudden, and irreversible. After the initial swell of speeches and laughter, I retreated to a quiet corner, not out of shame but by design. I sipped my drink, letting the room pulse around me, and for the first time fully detached. No words, no judgments, no reactive motions, just observation. I noticed the subtle alliances forming, the small tensions beneath polite smiles. Victoria's calculated dominance over the conversation, James's inflated sense of control, my parents' reliance on appearances rather than facts. It was all laid bare. Each gesture, each slip of the tongue, every casual brag or overlooked detail revealed a pattern of arrogance and mismanagement. They were predictable. They were exposed to anyone who cared to look. I catalogued it all. The timing of their remarks, the moments of weakness disguised as strength, the assumptions they made about me, and the opportunities their ignorance presented. Every slight, every dismissal, every attempt to undermine me became a thread I could pull later, a lever I could use when the moment was right. The more I watched, the more the illusion of their control unraveled. They were blind to the true architecture of influence in the room, blind to the quiet force they underestimated entirely. And as I allowed the evening to unfold around them, I realized something crucial. The next move wouldn't be impulsive or loud, it would be calculated, precise, and irreversible. By the time the wedding weekend wound down, I could see the patterns with startling clarity. Each slight, each dismissal, each assumption of my weakness formed a predictable rhythm. They moved through the wild as if their narratives were unchallengeable, never noticing the gaps in their understanding, never realizing that their own misjudgments were a map of opportunity. I detached myself from the old frustration and humiliation that had once accompanied such encounters. Instead of reacting, I analyzed. Victoria's subtle need to dominate every conversation revealed her insecurity. James's casual arrogance masked his lack of preparation. My parents' fixation on appearances betrayed their inability to grasp substance. Each misstep they displayed was a thread I could later pull, a crack in the foundation of their perceived power. I realized that my apparent invisibility was my greatest asset. While they underestimated me, I had been quietly building leverage in places they never considered. Their confidence in my supposed inferiority was a blind spot I could exploit, and every interaction at this wedding had given me the blueprint. For the first time, I felt a sense of control that wasn't reactive, it was anticipatory. I wasn't simply enduring anymore. I was understanding, calculating, preparing. The very energy they used to dismiss me would, in time, become the engine of my strategic advantage. And as I watched James laugh at another joke, oblivious to the undercurrent I had discovered, I knew one truth with absolute certainty. The moment to act was coming, and when it did, the shift would be complete, silent, and devastating. While everyone celebrated, I quietly assessed the assets they believed were beyond my reach. Years of meticulous documentation, silent investments, and carefully orchestrated witness alignments had created a foundation they could never have imagined. Every contract, every agreement, every minor decision they thought trivial had been catalogued, verified, and stored, not for confrontation, but for leverage. I had acquired stakes in ventures they considered family business without their knowledge, quietly securing control over critical operations. The $45 million semiconductor deal they counted on was entirely within my grasp. Their reliance on it was a blind spot, a vulnerability they exposed through their own overconfidence. Observing their interactions, I noted their assumptions, that I would never challenge, that I lacked interest, that my success was separate from their world. Each assumption became another tool, another layer of advantage stacked silently in my favor. No one suspected that the daughter they dismissed, the quiet niece at the wedding, was in fact the architect of their potential collapse, or their chance at redemption, if they chose wisely. I also had allies they could not see. Trusted colleagues who had witnessed my careful growth, advisors who understood the stakes, and internal auditors who could corroborate every figure, every deal, every claim. These unseen partners were ready to act, aligned with me, and entirely invisible to my family. The room around me pulsed with celebration, yet in that very energy lay their fragility. Their pride, arrogance, and ignorance had unwittingly handed me the keys. All I needed now was patience, timing, and the discipline to wait for the precise moment when revealing the truth would be unstoppable, undeniable, and irreversible. And in that calm, I recognized something exhilarating. The invisible hand of power had shifted entirely, and soon they would feel it. Over the next few days, I moved deliberately, each step calculated to maintain the illusion of passivity. Meetings, phone calls, and subtle shifts in correspondence became instruments of influence, setting the stage without ever revealing my hand. I didn't need to confront anyone directly. The smallest adjustments, timed perfectly, would ensure that when the moment came, the impact was undeniable. I watched James handle his obligations, noting every misstep and miscalculation. His overconfidence made him predictable, overestimating his understanding of the deals he was managing, underestimating the reach of my control. Victoria continued her performance of dominance, unaware that the very systems she assumed she influenced were already aligned with me. My parents moved through their routines, confident in their assumptions, oblivious to the truth simmering just beneath the surface. Every interaction became a test of timing. I refined the narrative, ensuring that when the revelation arrived, it would appear inevitable, not forced. Patience was as essential as precision. Even the slightest hint of impatience could alert them, diminish the effect, or allow them to maneuver defensively. I catalogued moments of weakness, hesitations, and inconsistencies in their statements and actions, knowing these would become undeniable evidence once the right exposure occurred. By the time I returned to my office, the scope of my advantage was unmistakable. The $45 million deal, the overlooked contracts, the silent acquisitions, and the carefully aligned witnesses formed a network of certainty. They believed I was removed from influence, a spectator to their success, but in reality, I was the silent pivot around which their fortunes depended. As I looked at the plans, the documents, the communications all carefully aligned, I allowed myself the smallest smile. The pieces were ready, the timing exact. Soon, the shift would occur, not with anger or spectacle, but with the quiet, absolute authority of truth. And in that inevitability, I felt the first thrill of real power. The following week, I returned to the office where James had convened his victory meeting. The same room that had once amplified my invisibility now felt like mine by right, though no one yet knew it. Colleagues shuffled in, unaware that the cost of the $45 million deal had already been subtly redirected under my authority. The hum of casual conversation masked the undercurrent of change I had engineered. James launched into his presentation, confident, assertive, unaware that every figure, every projection, had been verified and, where necessary, corrected by me. I watched him stumble over minor discrepancies, forced to improvise explanations that revealed both his overreach and ignorance. Victoria sat poised, but the slightest hesitation flickered across her face as she realized the numbers didn't align with what she had assumed. My parents observed, their expressions calm but eyes betraying subtle unease. They were sensing something amiss, though not yet understanding its scope. I remained seated, silent, exuding nothing more than attentive interest. Every glance, every gesture, every pause was intentional, a calculated signal of control. The room responded to me differently now. Conversations softened, attention shifted subtly, and the small cracks in their confidence widened imperceptibly. In that stillness, I realized the power had already begun to tilt. No speeches, no accusations, just the quiet weight of awareness and preparation. They were still playing their game, but the rules had changed. I was no longer a participant, I was the axis around which the entire outcome would revolve. And in that moment, I knew the first true opportunity to reveal the scope of my control was about to arrive. The question was no longer whether I could act, it was when I would strike. As the meeting progressed, James became increasingly animated, eager to assert his command. In his rush to impress, he revealed more than he intended, mismanaged timelines, overlooked obligations, and a chain of approvals that had been ignored. Every word was a misstep, each sentence a thread I could pull. Victoria, sensing his vulnerability, attempted to redirect, to cover his errors with charm and assertion. But her interventions only highlighted her own lack of oversight, the cracks in her assumed authority. My parents leaned in, their expressions flickering between confusion and concern. They could feel the shift, even if they didn't yet understand its source. I said nothing. I needed no interruption, no correction, no dramatics. Their own words, their own miscalculations, were sufficient. Each overreach, each slip, made the situation increasingly precarious for them. What had seemed like minor errors now appeared systemic, undeniable to anyone watching. And everyone in the room, from staff to advisors, began to sense the imbalance. They could see the consequence that awaited, though none dared voice it. The panic was subtle at first, a stammered sentence here, a hesitant glance there. Then it grew. James fumbled with documents, Victoria's confident posture faltered, and my parents, normally so composed, shifted uneasily in their seats. Without a single raised voice, without confrontation, the control had moved. The family that had dismissed me, that had assumed I was powerless, now teetered on the precipice of exposure. And through it all, I remained calm, a quiet observer with absolute clarity. I knew the final act, the revelation of truth, was imminent. All that remained was the moment, precise and irreversible, when I would show them just how much power they had truly overlooked. I stood, quietly collecting the documents I had prepared, each one a record of agreements, contracts, and transactions they assumed I had never touched. The room hushed as I approached the head of the table. No raised voice, no dramatic gesture, only the steady weight of certainty in my movements. "James," I began, placing the files before him, "everything you're relying on for this deal, the timelines, the approvals, the financial projections, has been under my oversight from the start. The $45 million semiconductor agreement, which you've assumed is secured, has always been aligned with my control." James froze, his confidence faltering as he skimmed the documents. Victoria's composure wavered, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face. My parents leaned forward, realizing the magnitude of the oversight they had ignored for years. I continued, calm and precise. "Every miscalculation, every oversight, every reliance you thought was independent of me was visible, documented, and verified. The assumptions you've made about my capabilities were entirely wrong." Silence followed. The air in the room shifted. Subtle panic spread as the reality sank in. James's mismanagement, Victoria's assumptions, and my parents' blind confidence were all exposed, not through anger, not through accusations, but through undeniable fact. The leverage had been mine all along. "I've given you the opportunity to rebuild honestly," I added, looking each of them in the eye. "But it must be on terms that reflect accountability and transparency. No applause, no confrontation, just the quiet, irreversible truth." In that moment, the balance of power had shifted completely. They had been operating under illusions, and those illusions had been dismantled with precision. For the first time in years, I observed them with clarity, humbled, unsettled, and aware of the mistake of underestimating me. And I knew, without saying another word, that the control I had quietly cultivated was now absolute. In the days that followed, the consequences became visible. James had to answer to stakeholders and advisors he had previously assumed were beyond my reach. His mismanagement was now documented and undeniable. Victoria's influence waned as colleagues and partners recognized the gaps in her oversight. My parents, once proud and dismissive, moved through their routines with a subtle caution, their gestures measured, their words careful. Meanwhile, I remained composed, quietly overseeing the restructuring that had been long overdue. Decisions were now aligned with clarity, accountability, and strategic foresight, principles I had always adhered to while they assumed I was struggling. The $45 million deal proceeded, but on terms I controlled, ensuring both the stability of the venture and the exposure of past assumptions. I watched interactions carefully, noting the new balance of authority. The room's energy had shifted. Respect was no longer performative or assumed. It was earned through recognition of competence and preparedness. My family could no longer dismiss me. Their pride had been tempered by reality, their confidence replaced with a careful acknowledgement of the truth. And through it all, I remained quiet, letting the results speak louder than words. Their misjudgments had become the instrument of their own correction, and my restraint ensured that power had shifted without spectacle, without unnecessary confrontation, and without emotional distraction. Sitting in my office, I watched the ripple of change settle across the family and the company. Nothing needed to be announced, no speeches delivered, no dramatic staged. The shift had occurred quietly, with precision, and its impact was undeniable. My parents now approached decisions with care, James moved through obligations with accountability, and Victoria had learned that influence could not be assumed, it had to be earned. I allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. Not satisfaction born of revenge, but of understanding, that true power is cultivated patiently, exercised strategically, and revealed deliberately. The satisfaction came not from humiliation or spectacle, but from the clarity of outcomes and the knowledge that the structures I had built were secure, resilient, and unquestionable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't humiliation, it's building what they said you couldn't. And in that quiet moment, with the hum of the city beyond my window, I realized that the measure of success isn't in being seen by everyone, but in knowing your own strength and allowing the world to catch up on its own time.